Hello and welcome back to Well That Aged Well. And this week I'm joined by Graaeme Callister, who has recently written Battle, Understanding Conflict from Hastings to Hellman. However, this week we are going to talk about the men behind Napoleons, such as Fouches, Talleyrand, his immediate family as well, and how they helped manage the court of Napoleon and behind the scenes. And this is going to be a really cool episode, I think, because this is something I wanted to do for a long time. And we did do a three-part when the Napoleon movie came out, right before the Napoleon movie came out, where we do a deep dive on the life of Napoleon. So if we're not going to mainly focus on him this week necessarily, but we're going to talk about him a little bit. But if you want more detailed episodes on Napoleon, I would recommend checking out my episode with Sakurait and Alexander Mikaberza. Sorry if I butchered his last name, but we did a three-part episode on Napoleon where we talk more about him from his rise to power to the Napoleonic Wars and of course the Hundred Days as well. So if you want more deep dive, check out those episodes. However, this week we are going to talk about Napoleon and his men behind the scene. So that I want to begin with Napoleon's right. Do a little brief talk about how he came into rise of power. So let's talk about his rise to become a general, and of course until the Brumaire coup and his crown until he crowned himself as emperor. If you don't mind.
Yeah, so Napoleon obviously is the ultimate kind of rags to riches story, isn't he? He's the man who is born into almost nothing in Corsica, who becomes emperor of the French. But really, he's a bit more complicated than that. He is the son of a man who claims to be Corsican nobility, so Napoleon can be educated in France. He can become a French officer because his father claims to be a Corsican nobleman. Corsica became part of France just before Napoleon was born, so it's a really good time for him to kind of get as part of this biggest country in Europe that is France. So Napoleon, born in 1769, goes to be educated in France at the age of 9, spends time at Autun and then at Brienne, becomes a second lieutenant of artillery, so a young officer. Artillery officers had to be quite good at maths, quite good at engineering, etc., but not really. They're not the rich ones. They're not the ones who are going to get promoted to the top ranks in the army. So
So
his
what
career,
made Napoleon so different from other generals then in the army?
well, he's as a young man, he isn't much different to anyone else. He's as a Corsican, he speaks Italian as a first language, so he's actually quite an outsider, but nothing really stands out. He is very intelligent, he is quite driven, but he doesn't really stand out. But then, of course, the revolution comes. And what then stands out for Napoleon is that he is, first of all, a supporter of the revolution. Even though his family are theoretically noblemen, he supports the revolution, then the Republic. So he's one of the few army officers who stays, and he is also very, very driven. His intelligence hones itself into a great military intelligence, a strategic intelligence, and he is willing to use politics, to use violence, to use whatever it takes to get ahead. So
Mm.
he, in the early revolution, goes back to Corsica, tries to kind of um, first of all make moves for Corsican independence. Then he throws in his lot with the French government, is thrown out of Corsica by the separatists, and in the end, he has to become fully French. He is given command of the artillery at the siege of Toulon, and here is where he really shows his military aptitude to start with. He can see plans that other people simply can't. So at Toulon, he formulates a plan to get the British out, to recapture the city, and this works perfectly. And he's promoted to general at the age of only 24 as
Mm.
as a reward for winning at Toulon. Um, Obviously, at a very young age, having not really commanded any artillery or cavalry or infantry in the field, he is now a general. Um, for the next 2 years, he doesn't really do much. But in 1795, in October 1795, the Republican government is threatened by a counter-revolution in Paris. A large mob of
Mm.
somewhat royalist sympathizing people want to overthrow the government, so they storm towards the government buildings, and Napoleon is given command of the few troops
Yeah.
that will defend them.
This is the
Here's
famous massacre, right?
Yes, yeah, his famous whiff of grape shot, and here's where he really shows himself to be again something different to other generals. Other generals might have tried to negotiate or withdraw, or might have surrendered, but no, Napoleon uses everything at his disposal to get rid of this mob. So he draws up a load of cannon and simply shoots the mob. No one else thought to do this in 6 years of revolution. No one else has had the
Mm,
ruthlessness to do this. So he shows that huge ruthlessness, and in gratitude, the Directory make him into a full general and put him in command of the French army in Italy. That army is not France's best army. Um, they're ill-equipped. There's not enough men, and they're fighting through the Alps. They're not expected to do much.
mm,
But Napoleon again shows his brilliance, his mastery of terrain, his willingness to push troops harder than anyone else, to take bigger
mm,
risks than most of the generals. And this Italian campaign is really where he makes his name. In very quick succession, he beats a series of Austrian armies, pushes them out of Italy, makes Piedmont surrender, and destroys their army. And within a couple of months, really, he has conquered North Italy, um,
mm. And brings
which no one
a
expected.
tremendous amount of treasure back to, but which also helps his popularity because and he brings a tremendous amount of treasure back to Parisian court as well.
Yes, absolutely. He plunders North Italy mercilessly, takes huge sums of money, takes paintings, takes everything he can and sends it back to Paris. The French government is short on cash, so they really welcome this as well. So he makes himself very popular. He is also a master of propaganda. Um, And what he does is, he creates an army newspaper. He writes letters home. He makes
Mm,
sure that everyone knows about his victories. That he makes sure that
mm,
everyone knows how good he is. And if he makes any mistakes, he covers them up through propaganda. So
mm.
by the time we
And
get to
we will
seven,
see this again with the disastrous Egyptian campaign as well. He come home a hero, even though the campaign was a disaster. He still managed to do. It's kind of like what Caesar did with the Gallic Wars and the Civil War. He writes his own propaganda, his own version of history.
yeah, absolutely. So after 1797, when he conquered Italy, the next year he is sent off to Egypt, um, and he's actually quite successful on land. He wins most of the battles, but the siege of Acre fails, and he has to withdraw. But he makes sure that all the news that gets back to France is positive. It's about victories.
Mm,
It's about scientific discoveries, and he is the hero of all of this. So
mm.
very
He
much.
doesn't mention the massacre of 2,000 prisoners of war that happened after the Battle of the Pyramids.
Yeah, the Jaffa massacre where he just orders the execution of prisoners, that doesn't get mentioned. The failure of the siege of Acre, which is partly his fault, that's blamed on other things. And in fact, he tries to spin it as he didn't really want to win that anyway, and withdrew to Egypt. He blames the admiral of his fleet, and the admiral was killed when the fleet was destroyed by Nelson. He blames him. So Napoleon deflects all criticism while claiming glory for himself. And by the time we get to 1799, he's 30 years old. He's been a general now for 5 years. Um, but he has won great victories in Italy. He's won great victories in Egypt. But people think his victories are even better than they were. And he is by far the most famous general in France and arguably in Europe at the time.
Hmm. Now we don't have to go into much detail on his marriage to Josephine, but because we're going to make an episode about that in the near future with as returning guest of the podcast soon. But let's talk about his return from Egypt and into back into Paris again.
Yeah, so he comes back from Egypt at a time where France is in the most danger it's been for about 6 years. Um, there are enemies on every border. The Allies, Britain, Austria, Russia, who has now joined the coalition, they are really threatening France. And Napoleon thinks that when he returns, he'll be given command to try to defeat this coalition. As it happens, the men on the borders actually manage to secure France. So Massena in Switzerland, Brune up in the Netherlands, they managed to defeat the enemy armies. Um, But Napoleon has come back at a time when people in France genuinely were worried that they might be conquered.
Mm,
They're also disgusted with the Directory government. This was a new revolutionary government from 1795 that everyone hoped would be moderate, but it turned out to be corrupt, inefficient, and so people want to get rid of it. And so when
Robespierre,
Napoleon comes
right?
back, well, Robespierre had gone in
Mm,
1794, and the Directory is kind of what replaces him.
mm,
There are five directors at the top of government. Um, they are meant to act instead of having one dictator at the top, you have five men at the top. But all this leads to is infighting, is squabbling, and the Directory had very little support from anyone. They declared bankruptcy or a partial bankruptcy in 1797, which really made them unpopular. And they were seen to be losing the war. So people wanted to get rid of this government.
mm.
They have this hero who's come back to Paris. And Napoleon, of course, courts this popularity. Josephine helps in this. Josephine is quite popular in Paris. Um,
Yeah. Sorry, you froze up a little bit right now.
she can introduce him to the right people, and she can introduce Napoleon to the right people, including men like Sereis, who will be quite important in this coup. And Napoleon, basically back in Paris at the right time in late 1799, is seen as the man who can really get rid of this old corrupt government
Mm.
and bring something new to France.
Mm. So let's talk about the Brumaire coup. I know I'm skipping probably a lot of things, details here, but it's meant, like I said, it's not really Napoleon we're going to talk about today, but we have to give some background. But let's talk about the Brumaire 18th Brumaire coup as well.
Yeah, so the only way to get rid of the Directory government is not going to be through democratic means. It's going to be basically forcing them to resign and creating a new government. And the only way that you could force them is through military force. Um, so some conspirators want to have a coup. Napoleon arrives and they invite him to basically command the troops. The
Mm,
basic plan here is that they are going to ask the directors to resign, and when I say ask, I mean force them or bribe them to resign, and then take the assemblies, so the Council of 500, the Council of Elders, or sometimes called the Council of Ancients. They're basically the French Parliament. They will take them outside of Paris by telling them that there's some plots against them and they want to protect them. And then when they're outside Paris, surround them with the army and force them to accept the change of government.
mm.
So this is the basic plan. And Napoleon, of course, is in charge of the military force for this.
Now, obviously, in a coup like this, it's important to have the army on your side, as we have seen throughout history and revolutions. So, was there worry that there would be not be support by the army, or that this coup could possibly fail? Was there almost 100% chance of success? I mean, like you said, the government were quite unpopular. So, what were the odds for success in this coup? And was there worry that this could possibly end in a disaster?
Yeah, there was some concern because the troops that were in Paris weren't the ones that Napoleon had commanded in Italy or Egypt. So they all looked up to Napoleon. They thought he was a great general, but they'd never served with him. So they weren't loyal to him personally. And so there was some concern that they might not support him. Other generals like Bernadotte, like
Mm,
Moreau, they're in Paris as well at the time. What will they do? Will they support the old government and rally the troops? Now, Napoleon tried to talk to them all to make sure they would do nothing, and they all more or less agreed to do nothing. Um, but there was some concern that these men, these soldiers, wouldn't necessarily follow Napoleon. And as it happened, actually, and we'll talk about Lucien later, but it
yeah.
takes the intervention of Lucien very much to persuade the soldiers that they should follow Napoleon.
Mm. Now, I've got to bring it up, and forgive me for doing so, but no matter how rubbish the movie were, and we talked about a movie a few years ago, we kind of see this scene take place. Is it fairly accurate scene, the premiere coup that is depicted in the movie? Was it bloodless, or was there blood? What did you think of the depiction, if you have seen the movie at all?
I, as with much of the movie, there are major problems with it, but actually, I thought
Mm,
this was one of the better moments of the film, not because it's accurate necessarily, but because it sums up kind of the spirit of the day. Napoleon does go into the chamber, tries to make a speech, and he is shouted down. and he loses his head. And the movie shows him kind of screaming and running off and stumbling and falling over while
Mm,
being chased by some very angry um, senators. But um, that didn't happen just like that. But it's true that Napoleon did lose his head, and the panic that you see from Napoleon in the movie is kind of what he did on the day. He loses control, and just like in the movie, where his brother is the one to step up and regain control and show that calm confidence, that is what happens. So the movie is awful, but that's actually one of the few bits that I don't mind so much.
mm, mm. So let's talk about the aftermath of the Brumaire. How did they set up the new government? And we know he became a council, but was there discussion about the title of emperor yet? We know he would become one in 1805, but was it talked about him becoming king or emperor at this point? Or because, like I said, we know he becomes a consul. But so let's talk a little bit about the aftermath and setting up the new Napoleonic government as well.
Yeah, so at this stage, Napoleon is still Republican. He is a committed Republican. Um, Basically, the idea is to replace the directors with three consuls, and Napoleon is on board with this. The intention of the civilians who had plotted the coup was that Napoleon wouldn't be one of them, but he insists, so he becomes a consul. He then maneuvers it, and he's now got the support of the whole army. He now has the support of the ministers and the whole central government. So he maneuvers it. So basically, he becomes first consul, the one with the most power, and he sidelines the other men. No, Sears, Duco, they get sidelined um, to the extent that no, Sears is kicked out entirely from being a consul, even though he planned the entire thing. Um, but Napoleon's not thinking at this point of becoming a king or an emperor. There were some people that thought that he might actually invite the king back. No, Louis XVIII, who is living in exile, the brother of Louis XVI, who had been executed. Some people think maybe that Napoleon has launched this coup and will reinstate the monarchy. But Napoleon quickly says, no, that's not the case. Um, but he is a Republican at this stage. There is no discussion of empire. There's no discussion of him being a hereditary monarch.
Mm.
That will be a year or two down the line still.
Mm. So let's talk about what the beginning of the Napoleonic Wars that would last for the next 15 years and how this would help, of course, form what would become the empire. So let's talk about the time as him as consul until 1805. I know we're gonna stop beginning with the good stuff soon, but we just a little background here.
Yeah, so Napoleon as first consul is, to everyone's surprise, really exceptionally efficient and effective.
Mm,
He very quickly brings in a new constitution that gives him a lot of power. He very quickly creates a new council of state to help advise him at the top. He creates new institutions in the tribunate, the legislative body, and the Senate as a kind of parliament. And he gets them all pulling in the same direction. He reestablishes France's finances, creates the Bank of France. He improves the efficiency of government. He creates prefects in each department. So France administratively is divided into departments. He puts a prefect in every single one to run the department on behalf of Paris. This makes government much more efficient. Um, he reforms education with the lycées, and of course, he begins things like
mm,
the Civil Code, codifying France's laws after the Revolution.
mm.
So a huge number of reforms in the first 2 or 3 years
And he
of
made sure
being
that
consul.
everyone has bread, and he controlled the bread as well, bread of wheat, food for the people. And sorry for interrupting you, but there's also I wanted to bring up his peculiar work hours as well because they were rather unorthodox, you might say. That he worked really long and he would even work in the bathroom when he took a bath as well. So let's talk about his work ethics and work morale as well under this time.
Yeah, he works huge numbers of hours in the day. He sleeps very little. He has naps during the day, but he sleeps about 4 or 5 hours. He'll eat very, very quickly. He was well known for not liking lavish long dinners. While most heads of state or heads of government would spend hours entertaining with dinners, he would eat very quickly, then leave and go back to the office. He had a lot of secretaries to whom he would dictate correspondence.
mm,
He worked exceptionally fast, and he could turn his mind to very minor details very quickly. Um, he was, exceptionally gifted as a leader in making quick decisions and making the
mm,
right decision. He had a brilliant recall for detail, so he could have a conversation with someone one week, do a huge amount of other work, and then a week later pick up the conversation where it had left off with the same level of detail. Um, and this incredible work ethic and working 18 hours a day with a team of secretaries, so he didn't exhaust too many of them. Um, this allowed him to get through prodigious amounts of correspondence, to make huge reforms, to meet with so many people as well, to persuade them that what he wants to do is the right thing. Because at this stage, remember, he is just first consul. He's got power, but he still has to persuade people. He can't simply order them. So
mm,
he works extremely hard as first consul, and by 1802 he's exceptionally popular. 1802 is a really important year. He'd made peace with Austria the year before, but in 1802 he makes peace with Britain, and this ends the Revolutionary Wars. Peace now reigns in Europe.
mm,
And at this point, people start saying, well, okay, France now is so much better than it was 3 years ago, so much better than before Napoleon. But what happens if Napoleon dies? Now, there have been plots against him,
mm,
royalists and Republicans. So what happens if he dies? Um, so at this point, people do start to talk about a hereditary system of government. But in the
mm,
meantime, while they haven't decided they're going to have an empire yet, what is decided is that Napoleon has done such a good job that he should be in this job for life. And so in
mm,
1802, he is made first consul, not just for 10 years, but for life. So he becomes the life ruler of France. Um, it's in 1804 that eventually people will say, well, okay, for your lifetime, France is secure.
mm.
What happens when you die? And that's when they decide on the hereditary empire.
Mm. Now, I believe that some of his historians have attributed his incredible work ethic in the early years of the his time as consul that kind of is partly to blame for his decline as well, the peculiar work hours and the little amount of sleep because it does affect someone if you don't sleep. And I'm even affected after one day of almost no sleep. So it's some historians, I believe, do contribute the work ethic that it actually has and I think we can see this even in leaders today who has great work ethic, the decline of the work hours. So do you agree that that partly is to blame for his, you know, decline by 1814, 1815, and his the way he declines, not just in general?
Yeah, I mean, it certainly could be part of the reason for his cognitive decline and physical decline later. But also, I do wonder if what we think is decline by 1814 is actually just him having to slow down. He can't keep up the same
Mm,
work ethic when he's 45 that he could when he was 30. And people by, 1810, say, expected Napoleon to work 18 hours a day, expected him to be brilliant at everything, to remember everything. And when his brain, just with the effects of age, by the time he
mm,
gets to 40, he can't remember everything. He can't work as long hours. He does get tired and fall asleep more quickly. When he couldn't do all of that work that he had done, people saw it as decline. Um, he also didn't delegate too well, so he had to centralize everything. He had to do everything. And that meant that when he did slow down in his later years, there was no one else doing the job for him because he hadn't delegated, no one was trained, everyone
yeah.
expected him to do it. And that did become a problem later.
Mm. So let's talk about, and I know we're skipping a lot of stuff here that we probably should have talked about, but that's let's talk about him becoming an emperor and the crowning of him before we go into the next topic of this episode. So let's talk about him becoming an emperor. And I think we talked about this in our episode with Zach White as well, where we talked about how Beethoven wrote on him to Napoleon, but then he tore it apart and changed the name because it was crowned emperor. And as well, Simon Bolivar was a big fan of him until he, became emperor. Ironically, he would almost go down the same way in South America as Napoleon in the end, but but both of those guys lost tremendous amount of respect when he was crowned emperor. So why give him the title emperor and not say king of France?
Well, the principle behind the empire was, publicly at least, that they wanted a hereditary successor to Napoleon. They wanted, if he died, they wanted one person who would become emperor after him. And they decided that the best system for this was to have a hereditary system, like a monarchy. But of course, France had just got rid of their monarchy. They didn't want a king, and Napoleon
Hmm.
didn't want to call himself king. And so they decided on the title emperor. A couple of reasons for this. One, because it's not king, but
Hmm.
it has royal connotations. But secondly, because an emperor rules not just his own land, but lands around as well. And this is what Napoleon was kind of claiming with the emperor. Emperors existed at the time. There was the Holy Roman Emperor, so he's
Hmm.
king of Austria, but he is the emperor of the German
Yeah.
lands, but he doesn't own them. Then there is the emperor of all the Russias. So Russia, but also surrounding areas. So Napoleon is claiming basically to be a Western European hegemon, the man in
Hmm.
charge of Western Europe
A
by declaring
Charlemagne
himself
in
an
a
emperor.
way.
Say again?
A Charlemagne, a new
Yeah,
Charlemagne in a way.
yeah, very much a new Charlemagne.
Because it does get
And
crowned by the Pope, even though that's mostly just ceremonial.
mm, yes, so he invites the Pope to the coronation because the revolution had broken with the Catholic Church entirely, but Napoleon re-establishes relationship with between France and the Catholic Church through the so-called Concordat, one of his big achievements, where he declares Catholicism to be the religion of the majority of French people. And as part of this rapprochement with the Pope, he invites him to the coronation. And this is a great symbol. The Pope travels all the way from Rome to Paris. Now, Napoleon doesn't have to go to the Pope and bow his head. The Pope comes all the way to Paris. But
Hmm.
at the moment of coronation, when the Pope is holding the crown, Napoleon decides, actually, the Pope has no right to crown me. He probably remembers that when the Pope crowned Charlemagne, this led to centuries of strife between the Emperor and the Pope as to who was better,
Hmm.
because people would who supported the Pope would claim, well, he crowned the Emperor, so he has more authority. The Emperor would point out, well, I have more soldiers.
Hmm.
Um, and Napoleon, remembering this, basically snatches the crown off the Pope and crowns himself. And he does this, it's said, because only the French people could crown Napoleon. He is their chosen representative, and so he crowns himself. And when he creates the empire, we must remember, he doesn't immediately stop calling it a republic. In much of what's written, he is the emperor of the French Republic. Now, that might seem strange to us. Republics and empires are different things. But he was very careful in the early years to continue with the idea of republicanism. The revolutionary calendar continued to be used till 1806. He continues with all of the strictures and achievements of the Republic. Um, he continues to talk about the French nation and the importance of the nation, not just the empire. So Napoleon in the early years of the empire is very keen on symbolism and language that links the Republic and the empire together as
Yeah.
if they're the same thing.
Now, this is where I think it's actually a perfect time to begin talking about someone in his immediate family. Because, well, what we see in the famous painting of the coronation, his mother is there, the teacher, but she isn't there in real life on the coronation. So I want to begin while we shy away from Napoleon. I mean, begin with his immediate family. I want to begin talking about his mother, because she was quite a force to be reckoned with. And she's one of those few who actually get away from almost scot free, who actually make quite a good fortune after the Napoleonic Wars as well, who get away without, without, without being punished or anything after the Napoleonic War. So let's talk about his mother, Letitia, and give a little background on her one before we go into other people of her family.
Yeah, so his mother's a really, really interesting character. She was very young when she married. I think she's about 15 when she marries Napoleon's father. Um, she has sons quite early with Joseph and then Napoleon. She's only 19 when Napoleon's born. She's only 18 when Joseph's born. Um, But Napoleon's father was apparently quite a nice man, but not necessarily a very strong character. And it seems to have been his mother that kind of held the family
Mm,
together. Napoleon's father dies in 1785. At that point, Joseph kind of becomes the head of the household, but it is really Napoleon's mother
yeah.
who is the one that keeps everything together. She's the one who makes sure that eight children are provided for on this very small holding that they have in Corsica. You know, they've got a house in Ajaccio, they've got a farm
Mm,
just outside, a few vines, but not a huge amount. They have one servant who is an old family friend, basically. Um, and it's Napoleon's mother who keeps things together. When the family gets thrown out of Corsica in 1793 because they oppose Paoli and the Corsican separatists, um, Napoleon's mother becomes kind of the hub for the family. The children go away and do things. Napoleon, becomes a general, and Joseph becomes a politician. Lucien becomes a politician. But when they fall
mm.
on hard
Is
times,
it
they
was
always go
it
back to their mother.
Was it Joseph who was about? I mean, we talked about him later as well. Was it Joseph that was originally studying to be a priest? If I remember, yeah.
Yeah, yeah. Joseph was destined for the seminary. So the idea was that he should become a churchman. They had an uncle who was an archdeacon and believed that Joseph would be well served following in his footsteps. So he was destined for the church, Napoleon for the army. Lucien and Louis both talked about the army and the church at various times in their upbringing as well. But Napoleon's mother was very much there with them through their rise in France. It was through her influence, partly, that Joseph married one of the Clary sisters, Julie, because the mother approved of her.
Mm,
Um, and so she brought them together. She did not approve of Josephine. Um,
mm,
she she never got on with Josephine, and that was a source of discontent for Napoleon. And I think Napoleon's mother disliking Josephine allowed all of the other brothers and sisters of Napoleon to dislike her as well.
mm,
Um, but when Napoleon became emperor, he lavished gifts on family and friends. He gave them money, he gave them land, and Napoleon's brothers and sisters mostly spent this, wasted it, um, used it.
mm,
Napoleon's mother saved it. She saved a lot of her money. She lived quite frugally. She lived just a relatively simple life. And at the end of the Napoleonic Wars, when everything goes wrong, when they all lose their lands and their money and their titles, Napoleon's mother is rich, and they all basically go back and live with her, or at least those who haven't had to flee into exile, go and live with her, and she protects them again. Um, you know, these children who are now in their 40s um, are protected by their mother's wealth after the Napoleonic Wars. So
mm,
she is a formidable character in her own right.
mm. Let's talk about her relationship with Josephine. Just like you said, that really disliked, or she disliked her. So let's talk a little bit about her relationship with Josephine as well. And did she try to influence in the political world as well, or did she realize that I'm just gonna sit back and enjoy my future wealth as well while I can?
She didn't try to influence Napoleon too much. She had certain values that she hoped that Napoleon would embody, but she didn't try to influence them too much. But what she did try to do was influence um, his marriage fundamentally. She didn't like Josephine. She didn't believe that Josephine was suitable. She wanted Napoleon to get rid of Josephine. It's said that it was Napoleon's mother who let Napoleon know about the affairs that Josephine had had. Um, Napoleon's mother encouraged Napoleon's sisters to disrespect Josephine. And when it came to the divorce, Napoleon's mother was very much in favor of divorce between Napoleon and Josephine. Um, but Napoleon's mother, for all that she was a formidable character, wasn't very interested in trying to steer France's destiny. No,
Mm,
she wasn't a political creature, and really just left the politics to her children.
mm. Now, she didn't like Josephine, but she didn't very much like Marie Louise either when they got married. But I maybe I remember wrong, or maybe it's just a fantasy from the movie. But did she try to instigate an affair with Napoleon to prove that he could get bastard that get children. We know that he did with the Polish mistress that he had. I don't remember her name. So he knew that he could get child when she got pregnant. But did Napoleon's mother as well try to infiltrate to prove that he could have children, that it wasn't just that it was Josephine's fault that they, could not get an heir to the throne?
Um, I don't know if that is true. I certainly haven't come across anything where his mother kind of instigated this. Napoleon's affair with I think it's Marie Walewska. Apologies for pronunciation, but she's a Polish aristocrat. This is an affair that happens when Napoleon is in Warsaw, in early 1807. And Napoleon's mother has nothing much to do with this. But it is that affair and the child that comes from it that really persuades Napoleon that it's not him that's the problem in having children. It's Josephine. So um, I, the affair is important, but I don't know of Napoleon's mother trying to instigate affairs. I wouldn't put it past her, but I don't know
Mm.
of it.
Now, the next person in the family that I want to talk about is Joseph, of course, because he's what I find one of the more interesting characters and of course, I find Caroline tremendously fascinating as well. But I want to talk about Joseph next because, like I said, he's one of the more interesting brothers of the family. So let's talk about him. And like we said earlier, he was about originally to become a priest. So what made him? What did he give that up when in exile? And then let's give a little bit background on why didn't he go? Why he did not go in the military like Napoleon did?
So Joseph, he's the oldest brother. He's about 20 months older than Napoleon. They spent their youth together in Corsica, the first kind of 10 years of Joseph's life, I suppose. Um, Running around, causing mischief, etc. So him and Joseph and Napoleon were very close as children. They are both taken to France at the same time, in 1778, and sent to Autun. And it's basically the wish of Napoleon's father that Joseph should be the one to have the best career. And the best career that they could imagine under the Ancien regime, under this royal regime, was through the church. Napoleon, as an army officer, they thought would never rise particularly high. He's going to be in unfashionable regiments. He doesn't have the money
That's
to
kind of
to rise
funny.
high. Yes. Yeah, they fundamentally under the Ancien regime had little chance of promotion.
Mm.
Um, and Napoleon, without money, without connections with the army, without a great family history of military service, they thought he would get to captain or major and retire. But Joseph in the church, well, he could become, no, an archdeacon. He could become a bishop. He could rise up through the ranks of the church because they had family members who were well connected in the church. So um, it was basically Napoleon's father who wished him to be a churchman. Joseph stuck at kind of seminary college for 5 years. He worked hard, but he didn't like it. He actually wrote to his father and said that he didn't want to become a priest and suggested that maybe he could join the army. Um, but the military college didn't like the look of him. Nobody thought he would be suited to be a soldier. And so he left France and left his education in 1783 to go back to Corsica without having become a priest. He fundamentally felt that he was not suited to the priesthood. Um, by this stage, their uncle, Fish, who was the famous Cardinal Fish
Mm.
later, he is able to kind of pull strings for Joseph to thrive in Corsica, but he never becomes a priest. Once Napoleon's father dies, and Joseph's father dies indeed in 1785, Joseph then becomes head of the household. So he uses his education for the family, but he never becomes a priest.
Mm. So let's talk about how when Napoleon gets power and how he eventually would land the throne of Spain and in the Spanish, not part of the war in the Napoleonic Wars.
So, I mean, Joseph is, first of all, we should say he is really important in Napoleon's story. He's really important in
Mm.
Napoleon's rise. When Napoleon and Lucien, to an extent, are on Corsica, and they're trying to basically fight with Pauli and the independence movement. Um, Joseph allows them to do what they want, and when the family gets thrown out of Corsica, Joseph then is really important in getting Napoleon his job as the commander of the artillery at Toulon. Joseph has connections. He's got friends in Paris. He's got friends, it turns out, in the south of France, and he uses those connections to get Napoleon this job. He also uses connections to get other brothers jobs later on as well. So Joseph is really vital in the early years. Joseph's also there in Paris in 1799 with the coup, and in fact, from 1797 to 99, Joseph is a member of the Council of 500. He is friends with senior people in the government. He really helps Napoleon's career in the early years. When Napoleon becomes emperor, um, of course, Joseph is the older brother, and it's really unusual for anyone to become king or emperor or leader of any country if they have an older brother. Um,
Mm,
so Napoleon has this kind of strange situation where he wants to honor his older brother, but he can't give him more honors than the emperor. Um, so when the opportunity comes around to start redistributing land in Europe, Napoleon decides that he wants Joseph to become a king. And first of all, the country that needs a king is Naples.
mm,
So in 1806, French troops invade Naples, throw out the Bourbon monarch, um, and Napoleon appoints his brother Joseph to be the king of
mm,
Naples. Um, Now, Joseph doesn't really want to do this. Joseph is quite happy being quite a wealthy French gentleman, but he is persuaded by Napoleon to take it on, and he tries hard. He does quite a good job,
mm,
actually, of being king of Naples. He imposes some reforms. Um, he actually manages to increase the tax income. He fights campaign against banditry. He builds roads. He introduces a council of state and a new constitution. He does well in Naples. Um, he never actually manages to fully control the country. Naples is a
mm.
very, very difficult country to rule, but he does quite well there. And so
And
when,
yeah, if I may sort of interrupt you, but I just remembered, but I read Michael Brower's trilogy on Napoleon a few months ago, and I remember him stating that Napoleon would sometimes give Joseph absurd orders that he meant that he would be a good way to govern Naples. But of course, most of them, not Joseph, did ignore because they were too absurd to follow. I don't remember the orders exactly, but I remember that he did not necessarily always follow his brother's instructions. Maybe for the better.
yeah, yeah, very much. Napoleon was a micromanager, and he would send instructions down sometimes about big ideas about how to run a country. Other times it would be quite specific instructions of, you need to burn these three villages because
Mm,
they've had an uprising. And Joseph sometimes listened to his brother, sometimes quietly ignored him. But most of the time, Joseph was caught between doing what he saw was best for the people of Naples and doing what was best for Napoleon and for France. He did appoint a lot of French advisors, and he did rely on the French army, which meant that his government had a really strong French flavor to it. But still, he tried his best for the people of Naples, but it was really difficult with Napoleon constantly giving often quite silly orders that he had to follow.
mm. So how did it go from being king of Naples to king of Spain? Because obviously we know that Napoleon fight quite a brutal war in Spain, and he also, really dislikes the Spaniards. He does not have respect for the Spaniards at all, but he does manage to travel to Bourbons in Spain as well. So why does he choose to send Joseph from Italy to Spain in the first place?
Well, this all kind of comes about because Napoleon fundamentally decides that Spain is not supporting him like it should do in the war, that they're quite inefficient. He doesn't like the Spanish government. And so in 1808, he basically decides he will intervene in Spain. And it's not clear from the start whether he wanted to get rid of the royal family and take it over or whether he just wanted to control them more, but he decides to intervene. By the time we get to spring of 1808, there's a kind of civil war brewing in Spain anyway. The Spanish
Mm,
king is quite unpopular. His son, Ferdinand, has a lot of support amongst the nobility, and his son tries to launch a coup. It fails. And so you've got the son and the father, the Spanish king and the heir to the
mm,
throne, almost at war with each other. And Napoleon says to them, well, why don't you come to France and we'll talk about this? I will mediate between the two of you. We'll come to an agreement. I already have troops in your country. And the Spanish royal family basically decide, okay, we'll go to France. When they get to France, Napoleon doesn't
mm,
mediate. Instead, he decides that both of these men would be very bad kings. He doesn't want either of them. He wants someone that's
mm.
much closer to supporting France. And so
Did they
he
have a good
basically,
point there?
uh,
Did-
yeah, he had a point in that these two men were useless.
mm,
Um, the Spanish king was very ineffective. He was easily led by his advisors. Some people say he was too influenced by his wife.
mm,
Godoy had held power for a long time as his chief advisor. Um, he's not a good king particularly. Ferdinand was reactionary, conservative. He was quite popular with some nobility and some of the ordinary people. But when he did come to power later, he didn't prove himself to be a particularly effective king either. So Napoleon has a point. Um, on the other hand, it's not the done thing to get rid of monarchs. But Napoleon basically says to both of them when they're in France, you two can't rule, you both need to abdicate now. They try to refuse, and Napoleon reminds them what happened last time. A Bourbon prince annoyed him with the Duke of Enghien,
mm,
ended up being executed. And so the two of them abdicate the throne under duress, it has to be said. They're being forced, but they abdicate the throne for um, or to leave it free. And now that the throne is free, Napoleon needs a man to place on it. He needs someone who will, in his mind, rule Spain effectively, uh, give it rational, enlightened principles of government. So get rid of um, some of the medieval systems, as Napoleon sees it, of control by the church, of superstition, of illogical and irrational government. No, he wants someone to rationalize it. Now, originally, Napoleon decides that his brother Louis would be the best man for this. Louis has been
mm,
king of Holland for 2 years. He is a very rational man. He likes to reform things. He's got a real passion for reform. And so Napoleon offers him the throne of Spain, and Louis refuses and says,
mm,
"No, you made me king of Holland. I'm Dutch. I refuse." And so then Napoleon goes to Joseph and asks him to move from Naples to Spain. Joseph is really reluctant to do this. He wants to show that he can do things in Naples. He's started to build relationships there, wants to be king. But Napoleon basically says to him, "Look, I need someone to do this. You are the only man I can trust. You're the only one I can turn
mm,
to. You're my older brother. I need your support." And Joseph responds to this plea, this kind of family plea from Napoleon, and agrees to go and become king of Spain.
mm,
So this is entirely Napoleon's doing. Now, he actually gets some Spanish nobles to invite Joseph to be king. He makes it seem like the Spanish are inviting him in. He tries to do it with a veneer of legitimacy, but this is entirely Napoleon moving his brother from Naples to Spain. Joseph is reluctant to do it, but agrees in the end to support Napoleon and to do this for him. But actually, it was a pretty poor move from Joseph because it doesn't work out well.
mm. Yeah, let's talk about his time in Spain because this kind of he did a decent job as we discussed in Naples, but what goes wrong in Spain? I mean, obviously, religion is one of the problems that constantly is a pain in his side. So, but that's what causes his decline, so to speak, as a ruler because he did quite fairly in Naples. So what changes?
Yeah, I think part of the problem in Spain is that he never has control of the whole country. There are Spanish armies still in the field. There's the Anglo-Portuguese army, and of course there is the partisan guerrilla uprising, what the French
Hmm,
call banditry throughout the countryside. And to control Spain, um, Joseph basically has to rely on the French army. There are not enough Spanish people who will pay taxes, support his government, listen to his reforms and his laws. There are some, but not enough to mean that he can run this country. So that's his first main problem. Even when the French armies chase the Anglo-Portuguese out of Spain, there are still some Spanish armies in the field. Even when they are defeated, the French still don't feel they control the whole of the country. He also has the problem that the French commanders, the marshals and the generals in charge of these armies don't listen to him. It's never clear who has control in Spain. Napoleon never tells his marshals to listen to Joseph. He has never appointed the commander in chief of all the French forces in Spain. So when Joseph gives orders to marshals, they ignore him entirely, or they send the orders to Paris and say, "Do you want me to obey this?" Which takes 2 months to get there and come back. And by the time the order comes back with a yes, you should do this, the time is gone. So they just don't. So there is very little coordination and cooperation from the marshals. Um, some of them work better with him than others, but they have no respect for him, and that's a major problem. Um, so Joseph is faced with a population that isn't listening to him, with a force of occupation led by French marshals that don't listen to him. He hasn't got his own army. There are some Spanish soldiers fighting for the French, but he hasn't got an armed force of his own particularly. So he basically can't do anything as a king. He also, it has to be said, makes some mistakes. In 1808, for example, when there's the uprising in May, he panics and he withdraws basically to the Ebro. He abandons most of Spain. This makes him look weak. This infuriates Napoleon. He kind of falls into lethargy later as well, when more energy might have energized the people around him to impose their reforms, to work harder. He just doesn't do a huge amount. So he makes mistakes. His personality maybe isn't suited to the difficulty of the time, but fundamentally
Mm.
he doesn't control Spain, even though he's its king.
Also, you had the famous siege of Saragossa in there as well. That with the, and I'm actually going to Saragossa in a few next weeks. So I'm really looking forward to visit the city. But we also have the famous Saragossa siege as well.
Yeah, very much. And this kind of becomes an emblem of Spanish resistance. No, this city being besieged by the French army, the walls are breached, but rather than surrendering, they decide to fight street by street through the city.
Hmm.
Every building becomes a strong point. Every street
Kind
is
of,
barricaded and
kind of an
defended.
Arnhem of its time.
Yeah, absolutely. And this is brutal street fighting, and the French hate it. Lang, who is in charge, hates it. But the French basically bring in their artillery, blast holes in walls, storm each building, and it's hugely bloody and costly. Um, but it becomes a symbol of Spanish resistance. People would rather die than give up their homes and give up their cities. And Joseph is fighting against this because this is the army that's trying to put him on the throne that is destroying his own people.
Yeah.
So he's really he's losing the propaganda war here when these things happen.
Hmm. So what causes the ultimate fall of Joseph in Spain ultimately?
It's military defeat in the end. In 1812, Napoleon withdraws huge numbers of experienced troops from Spain for his Russian expedition. Um, and then in 1813, when the Allies, now led entirely by the Duke of Wellington with his British, Portuguese, and Spanish army, when they launch an offensive, the French armies are not strong enough to stop them. Wellington bypasses Madrid this time. Joseph is forced to flee from Madrid. They decide to take a stand at Vitoria, um, where the French army is effectively routed. They lose all but one of their artillery pieces. Their entire baggage train is lost. The army flees in disorder. And at that point, Joseph has lost almost all of his territory. He's lost pretty much all of his legitimacy as well. And he's forced out of Spain. There's also the problem that Napoleon decides, in a desperate attempt to maybe stop the British, Portuguese, and Spanish invading southern France, he decides to release Ferdinand, the heir to the Spanish throne that had been forced to abdicate back in 1808. And he releases him on condition that Ferdinand signs a treaty saying that he will throw the British out of Spain and ban them from using Spanish territory. And Ferdinand signs this document, and Napoleon hopes that this will, make Ferdinand king of Spain. Fine, so his brother loses his throne. but Ferdinand as king will stop the British. In the end, Ferdinand goes back to Spain, does
Mm,
nothing to stop the British at all. But this kind of symbolizes that Joseph has lost his throne. Even Napoleon is willing to put someone else as king of Spain now. He never formally tells Joseph he's not king, and Joseph insists on the title of king all the way through to 1814, even though he's out of Spain. Um, but it symbolizes that even Napoleon realizes that Joseph is no longer in charge of anything in Spain, that he kind of releases Ferdinand and makes him sign this treaty.
mm. So what happens to Joseph after the Napoleonic War?
Well, in 1814, he's back in France. He supports Napoleon. He's made Lieutenant General of Paris. He kind of leads the defense of Paris, which fails. In 1815, he rallies to Napoleon again, um, and um, you know is one of his supporters there. And then when the 100 days happens, or rather ends, Joseph is of course on the list of people who, you know, supported Napoleon and therefore up for arrest. And so Joseph actually offers um, to Napoleon that Napoleon could pretend to be him, take a ship to America and escape, and that Joseph
Mm,
will kind of stay around and pretend to be Napoleon fundamentally, so that he can be the one that people target.
mm,
Napoleon
mm,
turns down this offer, and it maybe wasn't realistic. They didn't look that similar that people would mistake them.
mm,
But it's a really generous and brave thing to do. He wants to allow his brother to escape by offering to swap places
yeah.
fundamentally. Um, and that's kind of in July or late June, early July of 1815. Now Napoleon turns this down and says that it won't work and tells Joseph to himself go off to America. So Joseph does take the ship to America. It gets through the British blockade, and he goes and lives in the United States
Yeah.
in exile. He is then, of course, from 1821, when Napoleon dies, he is head of the Bonaparte family then.
Mm,
And a lot of Bonapartists look to him to try to reignite the French Empire.
mm,
They want him to try to be the one to maybe have a revolution, get rid of the monarchy, recreate the empire. But um, to his credit, Joseph refuses. He never wants to be an emperor. He doesn't want anything else. And until the end of his life, he does nothing that could destabilize France or try to recreate the empire. But he
He has
lives
quite a
in
successful
retirement.
life in America, doesn't he?
Yeah, I mean, he's a trained solicitor. He's a good politician. He's a very affable, friendly man, and he gets on well with people in America. They also like him. He's a celebrity. His brother was the
Mm,
emperor. He himself has been a king. So he gets on pretty well with the Americans. And yeah, he lives quite a comfortable life in exile, um,
mm,
which is, unfortunate that he's in exile, perhaps, but he thrives at least in his last years.
mm. Now, I know we don't won't have time for all of his family members because we do have a lot of people to go through. But I want to talk about one last one, and that is of course Lucien. Like you said, he was vital in the Brumiere crew. So let's talk a little bit about Lucien. Because he might be one of the lesser known Bonapartes to actually who actually is quite vital as well for the Napoleonic regime.
Yeah, very much. And I think he's maybe lesser known because during the Empire he doesn't do much. Unlike Louis and Jerome and Joseph, he doesn't become a king because Lucien is a Republican. Um, Lucien is the third of the brothers. He's born in 1775, so there's a 6 year gap between him and Napoleon. And the gap is there because the Napoleon's parents had two stillborn children in that period. But there's a gap. So there's kind of two generations, if you will, of Bonapartes almost. There's Joseph and Napoleon, who are a pair. They go to school together. They grew up together. Lucien is closer to Louis, he's closer to the sisters than he is to Napoleon. Um, Lucien is educated in France. He is sent to Brienne alongside Napoleon. He's meant to be a military officer. Um, and Napoleon is meant to be his mentor in the early years. But Lucien really doesn't get on with Napoleon when they're children. When he goes to school and Napoleon's the older brother, Napoleon's meant to be looking out for him. Lucien basically rebels against Napoleon and everything that he's told to do. They really don't get on much at all. Um, and then they don't really have much to do with each other after Napoleon leaves Brienne and goes on to be an army officer until Napoleon comes back to Corsica. Um, the French Revolution, of course, breaks out in 1789. Lucien is only 14 years old, and within 2 years, he's become quite politicized by this. And at the age of 16 in 1791, he becomes the secretary to Pascal Paoli, who is the famous Corsican independence fighter who has returned to Corsica now that France has had its revolution, and he wants to bring liberty to Corsica. And to start with, he talks about liberty within France, kind of, they can be part of
Mm.
this new French regime.
Just
But
more of
by
like an independence, like kind of what Canada would become eventually of the British Empire in a way.
Yeah, kind of you're part of this wider empire, you're
Yeah,
part of this wider country, but you have semi-independence within it, maybe.
yeah.
Um, And Pauli is talking about that, and Lucien works as his secretary. He's only 16 years old in 1791, but he's already very close to this man of power. But within 2 years, they've fallen out really badly because Pauli decides instead of being part of France, he now wants Corsica to be totally independent. But Lucien, he's very young, he's impressionable. He's read all the news coming out of Paris. He becomes a really committed French Republican, and he believes that the French Republic is what Corsica should be part of. And so he and Paoli have this big argument, basically. And Napoleon is also convinced that Corsica should be part of the French Republic. And so the two Bonaparte brothers, Lucien and Napoleon, who hadn't really got on as children, they become really close now, both wanting to be French Republicans and both opposing Paoli. Now, this doesn't go well for the Bonaparte brothers.
I'm sorry for interrupting, but wasn't Napoleon a big fan of Pauli as in the younger years? So what was it because they were expelled? So what caused them to
Yeah,
turn against it? What causes the family to turn against Pauli in
yeah.
the
No,
end?
Napoleon he hero worshipped Paoli in the younger years. He believed that Paoli would lead Corsica to independence, and Napoleon really supported Corsica independence up to about 1790, 1791. And at that stage, he begins to see that Corsica might be better as part of France. He sees the liberties that the French Revolution is bringing and thinks that if Corsica can embrace those, it will do better. He also realizes that more opportunities will be there for him personally if he's a French officer than if he's a Corsican one. He has made a colonel of the Corsican National Guard. He's given these commands that
Mm.
make him feel really important. Um, but he realizes that if he's French, he could become a general. He could become something even more important. So Napoleon begins to see that Corsica should stay linked to France. Paoli, though, is still committed to independence, and so they start to first of all disagree with each other, then argue with each other, and then they have a full-on falling out where their supporters start fighting in the streets, and that there are mass brawls, there are mobs fighting each other, and basically the Bonapartes are quite popular in Corsica, but Paoli is much more popular. So when it comes to a popularity contest and a fight within the island,
Mm.
Paoli is the one that's going to win. And Paoli does win. A mob storms the Bonaparte's house, rips it to pieces, and Napoleon, Lucien, their mother, their sisters, the entire family is forced to flee to France with nothing. Now, Lucien wasn't the one that caused this necessarily. No, Napoleon played a big part
Mm.
as well, but Lucien was one of them who had fallen out with Paoli, who
Mm.
kind of helped to create this situation.
So let's talk about what the Lucia do, and we talked briefly about it earlier, but let's talk a little more about his role in the 18 Premier coup.
Yeah, so Lucien, after they get kicked out of Corsica, Lucien has a few administrative posts and roles and jobs. But then, at the age of 23, he is elected to the Council of 500. Now, he shouldn't have been. You needed to be at least 25 to be elected to this
Mm.
council, and he's too young. But basically, Napoleon is so famous, and Joseph is already a really, really good politician, and the two of them persuade the government to accept Lucien as part of the Council of 500. And Lucien very quickly becomes an important member of this council. For 2 years, he is making speeches. He is proposing legislation. He is very visible as a member of the council. He then gets on to the kind of um, being one of the vice presidents of it. So he's not in charge of the Council of 500, but he will stand in for the president when he's not there.
Mm. Kind of
And
an
then
honorary title in a way.
yes, the president of the council is just the person who presides over their meetings. Like the Speaker of the House of Commons in Britain, a bit like the Speaker of the House in America, but with less power, maybe. But you're the one who decides what they debate, how long for, who gets to speak. So you have power to control what is debated in the chamber, but you don't make any policy. You're not, you don't have any power as such.
Mm.
But Lucien eventually gets himself made the president of the Council of 500. Um, and it's important to note that he's been on this council for 2 years, and he's quite popular. He's well known when he gets himself made president. Now, why this is important is because on the the day of the coup, Napoleon has persuaded the assemblies to go out to St. Cloud, just outside Paris. He says that there are plots against you. You need to be protected by the army. You should move out to St. Cloud. We'll surround it with troops. You'll be safe. That's happened. Napoleon's plan is then to go into the Council of Ancients and go into the Council of 500, tell them basically that they need to support a change of government, and that's it. But he goes into the Council of Ancients and makes a long, rambling speech that no one understands. He then leaves and goes to the Council of 500. By this stage, they've worked out what's happening. They've worked out they're not there for their protection. They're there because Napoleon's trying a coup. And so when Lucien basically says, here's Napoleon, he's going to speak to you, the 500 start shouting him down. Um, Napoleon panics. He shouts back, and then he eventually has to leave. And in some accounts, he has to be rescued by his own soldiers.
Mm.
They have to come in and push the members of the council back. Lucien then does, as president, he's in charge of this. So he decides that he will basically make the meeting illegal. So he declares that the council, by manhandling Napoleon, by attacking Napoleon in the chamber, he says that the council have acted illegally. He ends the session, which stops them from being able to vote anything against Napoleon. Um, and he basically closes them down. He then goes outside to meet his brother. Now Napoleon is still, he's lost control. He's still a bit of a wreck. And Napoleon is shouting at the soldiers and saying, you need to go in there and attack these men. We need to get rid of them. And Lucien can see that the soldiers don't know what to do. They think that Napoleon's a raving madman. These soldiers also are Republicans. They're the guard of the council. They should be guarding the members, not attacking them. So Lucien draws his sword. He's wearing a ceremonial sword as president. He draws his sword. He holds it to Napoleon's chest,
Yeah.
and he shouts to the soldiers, "If I believed that my brother was attacking the Republic, I would kill him now." And the soldiers are persuaded by this. They know this man. They know he is the president of their council. They know he's a popular member. They know he's a committed Republican. He's really, really firmly in favor of the Republic. And when they see him basically saying, I would kill my own brother if I thought he was attacking the Republic, this persuades them to start following Napoleon's orders. At that point, the soldiers basically march in with leveled bayonets and, throw the council members out of the windows, round up a few of them. Lucien goes back in as president of the council, declares the session is reopened. with a few dozens of the Council of 500 who haven't run away and who've been captured, and he basically makes them then vote that what Napoleon's done is perfectly legal and that the Directory is dissolved.
mm,
So Lucien keeps his head and he shows himself to be a man of action, and he really saves his brother's bacon on this day.
mm. So now, without the importance of Russia, we see that Joseph gets a throne, Caroline gets a throne after Joseph in Naples, and to forgive me, I forget the other brothers, Louis gets a throne in Holland. So why doesn't Lucia seem to get the recognition or the throne and the other throne that he might deserve, considering the importance? Was it simply age, or what was it, neglect that he did never got to be a king of some conquered country that by Napoleon?
Well, Lucien is a Republican at heart. He does not particularly believe in monarchy, but also he falls out with Napoleon in the next few years. He, to start with, is appointed Minister of Interior in France. So Napoleon clearly is appointing him to important posts. Um, but for various reasons, including I think his wife died around this time as well. But he becomes quite depressed. Um, he doesn't do a huge amount of work in the Ministry of the Interior. He does bits and pieces. Now he rigs elections for Napoleon, for example, but um, he becomes quite ineffective in his work, and the brothers start to fall out. Um, After they've fallen out, Napoleon sacks him as Minister of the Interior, and Lucien starts to sulk quite badly. He's sent off as ambassador to Spain, where he annoys Napoleon further because he negotiates a treaty that Napoleon thinks is really bad. Lucien feels he's been offended. So the two of them just have this big falling out, a clash of personalities, perhaps. So when it comes to 1804 and Napoleon creates the empire, Lucien is not really speaking to Napoleon anymore.
Mm,
Um, they coexist, but Lucien is refusing to do anything that Napoleon asks. Napoleon suggested that he should marry a princess, and Lucien refused. Um, Napoleon offers various posts, and Lucien refuses. And so when the empire comes about, it's clear that Lucien will not accept anything really from Napoleon. He is kind of tempted a couple of times to try to put himself back into the imperial succession. Um, he wants to basically be emperor after Napoleon, perhaps, but Napoleon refuses, and so Lucien sulks
mm.
even further. And so Lucien,
It's rather a tragic story, really.
yeah, absolutely. Lucien really just does not like Napoleon. Napoleon doesn't like Lucien. Um, the two of them can't get on. Lucien then goes and marries someone also that Napoleon really doesn't like, which is ironic given that Napoleon's marriage to Josephine is so
Mm,
unpopular with the rest of the family. Um, but Napoleon takes it as a personal insult that Lucien has married someone who he'd disapproved of. Um, and so Napoleon basically tells him to divorce this woman and actually offers him the regency of the Kingdom of Italy in 1805 and says, no, because Napoleon makes himself King of Italy. Italy needs a regent, someone to rule on Napoleon's behalf. And Napoleon, to try to reconcile with Lucien, says, divorce your wife and I'll make you regent of Italy. And Lucien refuses. Um, One, because he doesn't really want to do the work of being regent, but two, he just won't divorce his wife. He wants to annoy Napoleon, I think. And so 1805 was the last chance of reconciliation.
mm,
After that, Napoleon knows that Lucien doesn't want anything from him and will refuse any offers. Lucien is basically an opponent of Napoleon, to the extent that Lucien eventually goes and lives in England
mm,
at the end of, or in the last few years of the Napoleonic Wars. Um, so he's living in the country of Napoleon's great enemy.
mm,
That's how much he doesn't like his brother by the end of the wars.
mm. Now, there's a lot of more family members of him, but and I might do an episode where we focus just on these family members in the future, but we have to leave the family for now. So because there are a few other characters, and I know we just talked for a long time already, but there are a few other characters that I want to discuss. And the next one is the legendary police leader of Paris, of course, the legendary Fouches. So let's talk about Fouché because he's quite a diva, isn't he? He is quite the he knows the strings to pull. Let's begin with some background on Fouché and how he became the police chief of Paris and the tremendous amount of power that he would wield both in the Napoleonic and also how he would survive even under the restored Bourbon monarchy.
Yeah, so Joseph Fouché is a really interesting character. He's
It is
but
also,
ten
I'm sorry for interrupting you again, but it's also interesting how there's not really any biographies out there on him because he's one of those who actually just really deserve a biography of his career.
yeah,
It's from,
I think Stefan Zweig wrote a biography in French of Fouché 20 years ago or so. But
I don't
yeah,
speak French, unfortunately.
there's not as much on him as there should be, given how important he was. But he's 10 years older than Napoleon. At the start of the French Revolution, um, he was basically a teacher. I think at the start of the revolution. Um, but he gets elected in 1792 to the National Convention. He is a very early radical Republican. From the start of the revolution, he supports anti-clericalism, so he's against the church, he's against the monarchy, and as a radical and a Republican, he's elected to the National Convention in 1792. He votes for the death of Louis XVI. Um, and through the revolutionary years, he is basically pushing a radical revolutionary line. He is sent out as a so-called deputy on mission. This is people sent from Paris to bring the provinces back into line. And in Lyon, where he is stationed, he's accused of killing thousands of people um, to kind of force the area to be more revolutionary. So he is from his early years, I suppose. He's marked out as a very ruthless individual. Um, he falls out with Robespierre and is actually part of the group who gets rid of Robespierre in 1794. Fouché himself is briefly arrested for supporting the Radical Terror, but he's also a friend of a chap called Barras, who is really influential in the late 1790s, and that means that he kind of is released and goes through the late 1790s in a series of minor government positions. Now he's ambassador to the Cisalpine Republic at some point, for example.
Mm,
Um, but where his career really takes off is in July of 1799 when he is appointed to be Minister of Police. And this is basically because he was known as a ruthless individual from his time in the Revolution.
mm.
Uh,
He's kind of like a
and
real life Chavez, isn't he? In a
yeah,
way.
yeah. But he's also very much someone who will do anything to get the job done. Like I
Mm,
say, very very ruthless. Um, and Sieyès, who we've already mentioned, he's one of the men who will plot the coup alongside Napoleon. He basically wants a really strong man to be in charge of the Paris police, and so he appoints Fouché. And Fouché takes to this role brilliantly. He immediately creates networks of informers and agents. Any whispers or rumors of plots come back to him, and he comes down on them hard with arrests, um, with executions. He is a very, very effective man at cutting out plots. He's in post when Napoleon launches his coup, and actually Fouché was in a position to stop this. Fouché knew all about the coup. He knew
mm,
everything. Of course he did. He has agents everywhere. He'd heard the whispers, he'd heard the rumors, and he goes to Napoleon and he says, I know what you're doing. I'm on your side. And at that moment, Napoleon knows this might succeed. And Fouché basically supports Napoleon because Sieyès, who appointed Fouché, supports Napoleon. But this is where they meet around the coup, and Fouché could stop it, but doesn't. So Napoleon keeps him on as Minister of Police, and very quickly Fouché becomes the most important man in Napoleon's apparatus, basically for stopping plans and plots against him. Now, the
mm,
army is really important, The politicians are really important, but Fouché is the man who will stop plots, who will uncover who is responsible for assassination attempts, the man who will hear any rumors and whispers of opposition and will have it crushed. And from 1800 to 1804, Fouché basically does everything in his power to solidify Napoleon in his positions of authority. And he's really important in these years. And there's some examples of just how kind of ruthless he is and how committed he is to supporting Napoleon. So, Christmas Eve, 1800, uh, some royalists plant a bomb to try to kill Napoleon. And it goes
Yeah.
off and it blows up and kills some people in Paris. Napoleon is mildly wounded, but otherwise untouched. And he's furious. He wants the people caught and executed. And so Fouché goes to him and says, well, we have proof it was the royalists. And Napoleon says, well, that's a shame. If it was the Republicans, the Jacobins, I could have had them all executed.
Mm.
And Fouché says, okay, well, in that case, it was the Jacobins. And so basically, instead of blaming the right wing, he blames the left
Yeah.
wing for
Yeah.
this. He has them arrested. There are executions. There are exiles. They disassemble the Jacobins. And then Fouché says, well, now that we've got rid of the left wing, why don't we just admit it was the royalists and get rid of them? And they do that as well. So
Mm.
Fouché, unscrupulous, ruthless, very committed to supporting Napoleon. He is the man who really makes sure that the plots against Napoleon in the early years don't go anywhere. And he becomes really vital to Napoleon's administration, at least to start with.
So let's talk to what do Fouché do during the Napoleonic War? What is his role as a police minister? We know that, for example, from what I remember, he has an important role with Madame de Stael as well. So I want to talk a little bit about him and the intimidation of Madame de Stael as well, or Stael. Sorry if I say the name wrong.
Yeah, so Fouché's job as in 1802, he's actually dismissed by Napoleon, who gets rid of the secret police. I think because Napoleon's kind of scared of him himself. But then he's reappointed in 1804 to this new secret police role, and his job is a couple of things. One, it is to listen out for rumors, listen out for any problems. Two, it's to report on unrest in the empire. Um, and this unrest can be major rioting, or it can just be small things like, some gendarmes were shot at. It can also be about esprit public, the public spirit. Um, if there are people complaining or if there are people protesting, this will all be reported to Napoleon. And Fouché's agents across France report back to him, and he sends news every day to the emperor with this. Another role that he has, though, is surveilling people of interest. So
Mm.
high profile potential opponents of the regime. They don't actually have to have done anything. They just have to be someone that
Mm.
Napoleon thinks might do something.
It's
Madame de
kind of like
Stael,
an early version of KGB in a sense, what they would become.
yeah, yeah. It's a kind of a secret police that we would recognize from the 20th century as much as
Yeah.
anything. Um, and it's about surveillance and control. It's about knowing things, knowing information, knowing where the problems will come, keeping an eye on people. Um, and also making it very obvious that you are keeping an eye on people, making it known that they are being watched, because that stops them from doing anything if they know they're being watched. Madame de Stael is a political opponent of Napoleon's. She publishes things against him. She speaks against him in
Mm.
public. Um, no, she is well connected, well liked. Napoleon doesn't like her. He tries to exile her from Paris and send her off to the provinces. Um, but Fouché is very much involved in her surveillance and eventually having her exiled from France entirely.
Just
Um,
aside, it's a kind of a mini exile. It's not really an exile.
yeah, yeah. So people are sent away from Paris, so they can't be part of the political scene in Paris, and that they're kind of exiled
Mm.
to the provinces. But really, it is just just outside Paris. Sometimes they're told they can't be within 100 miles of Paris, um, but they're basically sent back to their country estates. And Fouché, he finds the evidence against people. He advises Napoleon who is dangerous and who is not. There is a suspicion that Fouché's agents are involved in removing some people, basically killing them, but making it look either like suicide or an accident. Um, whether this actually happened or whether it's people who know the methods of, say, the KGB or something from the 20th century and assume that Fouché
mm,
must have done the same is not clear. But his agents are feared across France.
mm.
Um, and the amount of information that he has and that he passes on to Napoleon is incredible.
Yeah.
He does know a lot about what is going on.
So now we mentioned Madame de Stael, who of course has one of the most famous saloons, and I believe Napoleon used to frequent in his early days, but they of course, like we said, would fall out. But how important were surveillance of saloons in Paris? Because they were kind of the socialize where people would go, especially the elite, would go and socialize and probably gossip quite a lot. So how easy were surveillance of saloons such as Madame de Stael's, for example, or other famous saloons that I imagine they were heavily looked at by the secret police as well, because they would be quite a gossip center for gossip in like those places.
Yeah, salons were maybe more difficult for the secret police to get into than most because salons normally you had to be invited. It's normally a private house,
Mm,
um, normally run by someone quite high up in society, so you couldn't just walk in off the street. So the average police agent um, wouldn't be able to get in there without being noticed, but they would be able to say pay the servants to listen out for gossip. Um, they would be able to um, pay one of the people attending to tell them what had happened. And also remember, a lot of people going to salons do support Napoleon's regime. They might be military officers or government officials, and they might report back as well on what they've heard. So salons were not a safe place to discuss opposition.
mm,
Also, if you know, five people who were all known to be opponents of the government met in a salon and there was no one else present, this would be seen as seditious. And Fouché would probably report this to the emperor, who would order steps to be taken for those people not to be allowed to meet, either by exiling them or just telling them, you
mm,
will be arrested if you do this again. So there were different levels of and ways of policing. Um, a lot of this, though, was through paid informers. So servants, staff,
mm,
they could be paid to say what's going on. Um, Salons never became quite the locus of political opposition to Napoleon anyway, because he gave quite a lot of benefits to people of the salon class. Um, the wealthy in Paris, the wealthy of France benefited from the empire, and so they never quite became the focus of opposition that maybe they had under the Ancien regime. But nonetheless, Napoleon made sure that they were surveilled and that he knew what was going on in them as well. And of course, when things didn't go as he wanted them to, he did take action, such as against Madame de Stael.
mm. So as we said while we began to talk about Fouché, what made was it simply the connections and the information he had that made him kind of untouchable? Because like we said, he would stay on even after the Napoleonic regime and into the reinstated Bourbon regime. So was it simply the information he possessed? And it's quite impressive that even though the Napoleon, most people would fall after the Napoleonic regime, he would be one of the few survivors who actually would stay in government and stay in his position of power. And you gotta, like him or not, you gotta respect that.
Mhm.
So what made him so untouchable, to use that term?
Well, information was one of the things. The fact that he and he alone controlled such a good network of agents and spies across France. Um, and once Napoleon gets rid of him, and he does in 1810, Fouché by 1810 has overstepped what Napoleon thinks is the level of
Hmm,
authority. So in 1809, for example, he gave orders to the army to deal
yeah.
with the British invasion of the Low Countries. That wasn't Fouché's job. Napoleon was annoyed that he gave those orders.
Hmm,
In 1810, Napoleon finds out he's actually been negotiating with the British government behind Napoleon's back. So Napoleon sacks him and says, "No, you're
hmm,
taking on more responsibility than you should. But even then, Napoleon can't do without this information. These spies, these agents, nobody else can take over. Nobody else can do that job. Um, so Napoleon has to continue to go back to him for advice and to
Mm.
listen to him. There's also the consideration that there are other really powerful men in Paris,
I mean,
in
just
government.
imagine having that power. Just imagine being this untouchable man. And even if you, no matter how much you wanted to, you can't really get rid of him in any way. Imagine that was, imagine feeling this powerful, you know.
I think Fouché knew when to stop pushing, though. He never threatened Napoleon. He didn't try to take power himself. Um, he plotted behind Napoleon's back. He discussed things with Talleyrand, for example, about the imperial
Mm,
succession that Napoleon didn't want them to discuss. But Fouché also knew when to stop, because he knew that fundamentally Napoleon could have him shot. Um, there's power, and Fouché had soft power, power behind the scenes, but Napoleon still had real power. Um, Fouché, though, did also have a lot of information that he didn't share with Napoleon. And there was always a fear from people that he knew their secrets. He knew who your mistresses were. He knew how much money you'd spent. He
mm,
knew what you shouldn't have done and you had. He knew all your secrets. And even if he didn't know, people thought he knew. So
mm,
he had a lot of people in government who didn't like him, but who continued to listen to him. And if he spoke, they
mm.
felt that you know, pretty much they had to listen. Um, No, the last years of the empire, the last 4 years, he doesn't really have official roles. He's a senator. He's sent on a couple of diplomatic missions. Napoleon continues to use him, and to
Mm.
listen to him, but he's not at the center of government as such at the end of the empire. But Napoleon simply can't make him just go into retirement because he is this influential man.
Mm.
Um,
He's
when
also
Napoleon
invited back in the 100 Days as well as a police chief of police. So that's just to
yeah,
show his power.
yeah, so when Napoleon falls and the first restoration comes back in 1814. Fouché had voted for the death of Louis XVI. He was a regicide, and therefore he is on the list of regicides to be proscribed, thrown out of France,
Mm,
forced to retire from public life. So the Bourbons are not going to give him an official position. When Napoleon comes back in 1815, Napoleon knows that there will be plots against him from the royalists, from the republicans, from everyone, from every foreign country, and he needs strong men and he needs information. So he calls Fouché and he reappoints him Minister of Police and asks him to take on this old role, which he does in the 100 Days. But while he's doing that, he is also negotiating with the Allies. And at this point, you can see that Fouché is working not just for Napoleon, but for himself. Maybe not even for France,
mm,
but for himself. He's working for Napoleon. He's also negotiating with the Allies very secretly behind Napoleon's back. Um, he is collecting information, but not passing it all to Napoleon. He's solidifying his own power base. Now, in the end, Napoleon's defeat, of course, is a military one. He's beaten at Waterloo. He decides to abdicate. Fouché is one of those who is in the conversations around the abdication. Um, had Napoleon decided to use force to keep power, Fouché may have supported him. But once Napoleon's gone, Fouché is one of the most powerful men in Paris in a position of authority. And he basically helps to negotiate the return of the Bourbons again.
mm,
But the price of him negotiating their return is basically that they need him. When they come back for the second time, they know that France doesn't like them. No, they've just been chased out. Um, there are royalist uprisings in the south and in the west, but most French people, it seems, don't like the Bourbons, and so they need someone to help them establish their regime. And Fouché is the best man for that job. Um, you know, he can now put his spy networks to work for the Bourbons like they had for Napoleon. And so there's this really interesting moment basically where Louis XVIII has to appoint Fouché as Minister of Police, and Fouché is the man who voted for the death of Louis XVIII's brother in the revolution. It was 23 years before, but I think Louis XVIII was still quite upset about it. And
mm.
so he, against his own wishes, is forced to appoint Fouché, and that's a measure of how much power Fouché
Yeah.
had. Um, and very much he not just survives but thrives with this second restoration.
Mm. So so he's chiefs. How long does he stay with the Bourbon Restoration? Until is it until his death, or does he eventually retire? Let's talk about the aftermath of the Napoleonic regime and his role in the new restored Bourbon regime.
I mean, he actually doesn't last that long. Basically, 1816 is when he's sacked and thrown out of France again, actually, because he is still a regicide. And this is because while he's solidified the Bourbons in power, in the 6 months or so that he was in post under the Bourbons, he roots out plots, he stops any opposition to them. But by early 1816, the Bourbons have an army of occupation from all of the Allied powers of Europe. There's been the anti-Bonapartist purges. There's been elections of an ultra-royalist assembly. Basically, there are enough other institutions in France that support the Bourbons that they don't need Fouché anymore. So they sack him in 1816. Not only do they sack him, but then they tell him, "Well, you voted for the death of the previous king. You're not welcome in France anymore." So they actually send him into exile
Mm.
and throw him out of the country entirely. He goes off to the Austrian Empire and lives there. He's a very, very wealthy man, partly through bribes and corruption, partly through good investments, I suppose. But he's made a huge amount of money from the empire. He's allowed to keep it. He takes it with him, and he lives the last, I think, 4 years of his life in exile. Um, very comfortably on his wealth. So he doesn't last that long under the Bourbons. Um, but it's really impressive that they are forced to work with him
Yeah,
at all, you know, given his history of violent republicanism and and being a regicide.
yeah. And that's where I think we're gonna round up this episode because we spoke for so long. In this part, we decided that it's best to do a two-part series episode on this topic because there's just too many characters behind the scenes of Napoleon to talk about, and I could do probably an entire podcast just on this. But we are gonna do a two-parter for now, and next week we will talk about people such as Murat. We are going to talk about his relationship with Caroline, of course. We are going to talk about Talleyrand, Bernadotte, and others. So stay tuned for part two next week. This is before we go, of course. I almost forgot this. I want to say thank you again so much for coming on the podcast. And do you have anything you want to promote? Any links you want to share in the description? Where can people find your book, the book that you wrote? And of course, do you have any social media that you wanted to share if people have further questions about Napoleonic people behind Napoleon or general Napoleonic history? Where can people find your socials, or if they want any more information about from what you from your work?
Yeah, so you can find me on Twitter, X, and on Blue Sky at Graaeme Callister. So I'm on both of them. You can also get my books. There's Battle, Understanding Conflict from Hastings to Helmand, and there's Waterloo, The Attack of First Corps, both through Pen and Sword. So if you pop on the Pen and Sword website, you can find them. But if you are on X or Blue Sky, do drop me a follow, drop me a message, and I'll follow you back. Be great to see you on there.
Fantastic. This has been That Aged Well. We are available on Spotify, Apple Podcast, YouTube, wherever you can find podcasts. If you are on Spotify, of course, consider giving us 5 stars. That would be lovely. If you're on Apple Podcasts, give us 5 stars and leave a little review. That would be nice. If you are on YouTube, leave a comment and share or like, share, and subscribe. Is there any other? You can also leave us comment on Spotify, and I'll try to read them if you do. And if is there any other parts of Napoleonic War or war that you want to cover, I'd be happy to try to do so. This has been With That Aged Well. We are available on social media under With That Aged Well on both Instagram, Twitter, or Blue Sky. This consider doing it to follow and stay tuned for part two next week. This has been with that issue 12. My name's Alan, and I'll see you next time.